Hi, everybody. I'm a little biased here. I think we've got the best panel of the day, but all of them have been fantastic. Just an entire day capped of software-defined workflows, production workflows. Really, at the end of the day, if you haven't figured it out, workflow is the theme of the day, and it's something I'm passionate about. Workflows are the one things that always changes. Sometimes other things don't change as much, but somehow or another, everything that has something to do with people and technology, there's a workflow involved in it. So I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves. So we'll start with the gentleman on my left, a coworker of mine at Diversified, Tom.
There you go. I'm Tom Carlisle. I get the opportunity to lead the cloud engineering and innovation team at Diversified, and hand over to my friend Chris here.
Hello, I'm Chris Gefken from Goldman Sachs. I head up the technology surrounding live event, theatrical and broadcast production, video post, and we do the technology around the digital signage as well.
I'm Eliza. I'm on the Adobe digital video and audio product team. Our team focuses on the partner ecosystem, so our surrounding technology partners, system integrators, on the Frame.io side of things, camera to cloud partners that all enable and enhance workflows for our customers.
I'm Justin Pohlman. I'm a lead solutions architect with NEP. Kind of manage the cloud and centralized production side of things for U.S. broadcast services.
So this is a big topic. I mean, what we're trying to do is just carve out, a small. Oh, sorry, John. Not
a problem.
The host.
Pay no attention to the man behind the. Hey everyone, John Soldo calling in from Carpinteria, California, home of one of the major hubs for LinkedIn Learning Studios. I have the privilege of working with a bunch of really awesome engineers who are focused on one thing, which is powering the productivity of LinkedIn's internal content creators. So finding ways to automate all those mundane, repetitive tasks that get in the way of doing what they do best, which is being creative. So thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
And that, in a nutshell, kind of talks about we'll get to that in a second. But the first thing, I guess, what I was going to start to say was, this is a big topic. So how do we kind of hone it down to specifically live production, post-production? How do software-defined workflows, software-defined networking is a bit of it, but not so much as the workflow itself? How do each of you define what software-defined workflow in your individual environment means? Like, what does it mean to you when you go into work every day and you work with your customers and clients? What's the solution? What's your answer?
So if you're working in the cloud already, if you're working with products like Puppet or Chef or Ansible or Postman or a tool like that, you're already using software-defined workflows to get your job done. For us moving forward, we're seeing things move away from hardware stacks and big box pieces, and they're starting to move towards software-defined workflows that are a piece of software running somewhere. Could be in your on-prem environment, could be in a cloud environment, could be in a truck somewhere. And to be able to build that infrastructure, scale it to the size you need it to be, and then orchestrate that to logically define the I/O and the processing and all those pieces. That's how I define software-defined workflows. And literally, we're all doing that more and more every day as we start to look at different ways to spread out and differentiate and diversify our production environments.
I'm going to sort of echo on what Tom was just saying. I mean, you're right. We've all been dealing with software in various forms for years, right? The orchestration of those various softwares operating in concert, I think that is what a software-defined workflow is, in my mind, would be.
Yeah, huge topic, huge question. I think something that I enjoy about my current role at Adobe is that we're working. Like every day I get to talk with our partners in the ecosystem, and there's such a variety of workflows that involve our software, right? And I focus primarily on Premiere Pro and After Effects, but the customer base has changed a lot, in the last few years. There are so many new workflows that are evolving for enterprise, for small teams, for individuals, that we're constantly having to also keep up to date. And I think that's really what it means to me too, because it's an enhanced collaboration, and knowing that, Adobe as a software company, we need hardware partners as well. And that's part of our partnerships as well, working with hardware partners, OEM partners. A lot of people here in the room, our technology companies here represented in the room are technology partners as well. And it's really working hand in hand with our partners and listening to our customers that enables, I think, the company to continuously innovate and be creative, especially in this new phase of AI, to be able to make room for the new workflows, I think, that are constantly being created every day.
So
if I could jump in.
Go ahead.
So, riffing off of what Eliza just said, our team, we're essentially an embedded engineering team, right? So we work right alongside with our creatives, like I said a moment ago, to make them productive and successful. So for us, a software-defined workflow is really just the building of that system, right? Software component, hardware component, but it's system thinking. So it's building that system that brings together a highly configurable set of tools and connecting them, right, orchestration or workflows, through some sort of automation that supports their needs. And I think one of the things that we'll get into today is really focusing on the needs of that user base is what becomes really, really important. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's been well said that software-defined workflows have permeated all of our workflows already. For NEP, it's a vast range of pieces that it takes into the workflow, whether that's integrating vendors' software-defined workflow into a mobile unit or production facility, or expanding and including software-defined networking into our productions, as well as the kind of the gold standard would be an ephemeral production that is entirely software-defined and spun up as needed, whether that's in the cloud or on COTS hardware.
So is the low-hanging fruit for your workflows, your customers, where you can make things more efficient for less and manage things more securely, more resiliently, or where do you start? Like if you come into a meeting and somebody says, Chris, we're not monitoring things on the level we want to be monitoring issues or problems with. Where does your head go with that? Where do you go, and how do I put technology in place? Where do you start?
I call an integrator. No, because I come from a background of integration. I was a broadcast systems integrator in a previous life, and begot my job today by building Goldman's last broadcast facility, and I stayed. But consequently, I'm not on the cutting edge of where every little piece of this puzzle is, where like the integrators are, and like some of you guys are. So I would approach that like, yeah, let me define all of my challenges in an everyday workflow from the people I work with. I will ask them, and in turn, I'll ask Tom, can you come in, look at our workflow, and tell us how we do it today, and tell us how we might want to check out how we might do it tomorrow. And they did that. And that is exactly how we would attack it. I'm going to hand it over to Tom.
Yeah, it's honestly shocking how you can look at a 60,000-foot view of a production facility like this, and there are workflows going on in that control room right now that someone does every day that there's other people in leadership that don't really know that that's a workflow being done. So to go and dig down and find out what Jim or Mary or Bill are doing in that chair when they set something up, so that you can then figure out how the orchestration model has to be built around allowing that to be an automated workflow, so that they don't have to think about, hey, when we're getting this feed from XYZ, we have to transcode that feed to a different format in order to be able to have it work in our plant. It's just something that gets done along the way as part of the supply chain that comes in, so it smooths over that workflow.
Justin, what things have you guys seen where you've walked in and said, oh, we can help with this, this, or that? If you could give some specific examples, that'd be great.
So we talked about it all today, 2110 and the complexities that brings. Software-defined workflows is like a requirement for that. It's gone are the days of engineers being able to patch cables and make things work easily and quickly. You need software-defined workflows to manage these massively complex systems. And without it, it's not feasible for one human to be able to go and route a bunch of video feeds anymore.
I was at a major network a couple of weeks ago, and they were using an orchestration piece of software in a way that the company that sold the software had no idea they were using it that way. And they subsequently flew some of the folks that were in that team to the corporate office of where said software company was, and it was an interesting dialogue. You have some slides I think you wanted to show. Or do you have a slide?
I don't know if we've gotten to it.
Right.
Yeah, so, I mean, we can. So this is TFC. Well, it's not TFC. It's a very broad example of what TFC is. This is NEP's approach to software-defined workflows. It's overall orchestration. The idea here is that anything in the production facility or part of production is controlled by one single pane of glass. So whether that's networking, video routing, production switching, the goal is to give the end user one interface and tying into different vendors. They're using their APIs or creating our own solutions from scratch. It all looks the same to the end user.
And does the end user have the ability to customize that, or do they require intervention on NEP's part to modify it?
Yeah, there are pieces of it that are customizable, but overall the solution, the system itself is infinitely customizable and built bespoke for each client.
Okay. John, I have a question for you. You didn't know this was coming. So I visited the Carpinteria Studios years ago, Gary, and Mr. Leyden was there giving us the tour. It was incredible. How has that system, and you're more than welcome to talk briefly about how that workflow of deploying those kits to people that are creating lynda.com and LinkedIn Learning videos work. What's progressed over the years? How's that worked for you guys so far?
Yeah, thank you for putting me on the spot. So, a couple of things, right? I'm not sure what year you joined us, but in this last year, we completed a pretty massive migration from really heavy siloed on-site pockets of storage. Think a petabyte or so per location. We've moved that actually to Azure. We've done that for a variety of reasons, for collaboration, for scale. And in doing that, it's opened a bunch of doors in terms of what we can do from a collaboration standpoint, but from an automation standpoint. And so, the kits that you talk about, that last mile is often the hardest thing to solve for. I didn't say this in my opening, but my team, we've been really focused on a lot of post-production workflows. And so what we found is now that we have these assets centralized at a global level, when we build something that benefits one team, everyone else can benefit from it. And I think that's part of these whether we want to call them software-defined workflows, but really being cloud-centric for us, but automation and software-defined centric, we get that scale piece. So I'll give you a very, very quick example, and then we can move on. For a long time, we've worked in a parallel method, right? There's a production handoff. It goes to a post-production team. They do some stuff. Maybe at the end, they create some transcripts, or maybe along the way, an editor has to work remotely, so they create a proxy so they can do their jobs more easily. And what we found in getting really close with that end user, like I mentioned being an embedded team previously, we found, well, hey, we can drastically improve time to market. If we just fire off a bunch of stuff based on a certain set of criteria, right? Remove the human element. So now a piece of content hits our centralized storage, and then through an orchestration service, we rip out the audio, we create WAV files, send that over to the audio engineering team for processing. Some of those files, based on a set of criteria, get processed, automatically fixed and returned without human interaction. Those proxy files get spun up, deposited right where those editors needed to be, without them needing to wait for it. So when they come in the next day, those proxies are ready to go. They can work remotely as needed. And then similarly, what's the third? Oh, transcription. We used to have to wait till the end of editing for transcription processes to happen. And then, our technical writing team, those can get started. But now we have those at day one, right? So think about that. We went from having to wait 3 weeks for all those assets to be ready to they're ready, within 12 hours of production being complete. It's totally changed from a serial pipeline to very much a parallel pipeline, which is completely, sort of reinvigorating how teams get things done. So hopefully that helps.
No, that's awesome. Thank you. And you guys were at the front end of well before COVID defining those workflows, and it was pretty cool to see, obviously the progression of that. A friend of mine that I used to work with at Microsoft was developing cloud production workflows very tightly with a significant vendor. I know we're not naming names, but I'm going to say it's Grass Valley. They were doing some very early innovation in terms of adopting basic things and then advancing into other technologies. I don't work for Grass. I just think they were at the front of it, so I'm calling them out. We were looking at taking all of our vMix machines we had 15 rooms with vMix running, and going from a $700 licensed model in perpetuity to a $1,000 or more per month cloud license, all of the assets, the storage, the processing. So my long-winded question to the panel is, how do we get better at defining how, when you're a customer or when you're a provider or service provider, how to say, here's how much this is going to cost for this much work per year or minutes per day or whatever. It was unknown to me, and that's why we kind of stayed away from it. How do we help that story? How do we help solidify when it's a right size and it's a fit, it works? And Adobe is an easy one to talk about. I'm going to toss to you. I get to pick on you now. How is your organization working through some of those variables for a customer that doesn't know, especially if they're launching a cloud instance in an edit room where typically they know what that machine costs to run per year or per day? So tossing it to you. And you have some slides too, I think.
I do have some slides. If you can maybe bring that up. So I'll hit on that question in a little bit, but kind of paint some context around how our team operates as well. If you could go to the next one. So I mentioned we work across, our ecosystem, the whole video creation pipeline. So from import to export, even pre-production and production, we need to make sure that, the latest cameras formats are supported for our software. So a lot of our engineering and product team behind the scenes are working with, the camera partners of the world, Sony, Nikon, Canon, to make sure that everything's supported in all the software. And then when it comes to editing and such, like on the software side of things, I work really closely with a lot of new AI integration. So like whether that be in the form of panels, plugins, John, you mentioned transcription workflows, and there's new assistive AI capabilities in Adobe software right now that really helps with that. But our partners really help take that a step forward as well, right? Like there are edge cases that we can't necessarily always address. A variety of use cases worldwide too, and it's really the flexibility of the software and the largeness really of the open ecosystem that really helps address all of these needs. Audio, export as well. Next slide. So prior to Adobe, I'm also like from the both production and post-production world, so in documentary and then in live sports production and broadcast was my most recent experience. But what's really neat is the various workflows that we're really working hand in hand with our technology partners to help solve. So a variety of customer stories and case studies that we've recently launched talk about these, so how we're enabling more on the social side of things, content creators YouTubers, for sports, for live sports production, partners that we're working with, for live replay, clipping, on cameras and like data project management as well, and then film schools, and we recently partnered with some hardware virtual production case studies as well, that you'll be able to see there, and on our monthly Adobe live streams, which I help host every month. We're always talking about various workflows for both enterprise and then individuals and consumers as well. And next slide, I think, is just a bunch of QR codes if you want to learn more, because I don't want to ramble too much. But yeah, to address your question as well, and of course, Adobe is a really large company, and I can't speak on behalf of every team. But yeah, the cost factor is definitely like one question that often comes up when it's like we partner with so many companies, but we don't necessarily determine like the pricing. That's a different team. But it's for like for enterprise use cases specifically. I think there are long-standing relationships that we have with a lot of vendors and with those customers, and where I focus is on the consumers and like individual workflows, and that's a constant, I think, concern as well, because being, previously an editor and creator myself as well, and I freelanced for quite a bit, you don't necessarily know when your next gig is going to come, right? And these are like more reasons why we need to be empathetic listeners, I think, and also be working hand in hand with our technology partners to be able to realize like the various use cases that may not be front and center necessarily for our teams. I think historically been very focused on, let's say, specialized workflows, right? Like Hollywood studios, the editors that are just cutting, just trimming, or just, the colorists. But now we have the really rise of like the interdisciplinary editor, right? That's wearing multiple hats, who's also dealing with elements of pre-production and production and post. How do we really make sure that the solutions that we're crafting and working with our partners in order to address keeps this persona in mind? So it's a work in progress, but I think it's crucial to be able to evolve and adapt with that in mind.
And I love the last session they were talking about, it's not AI is the scary big bad monster. It's like, hey, we're using it, we're participating, we're networking with each other, we're sharing tools. I thought that was a really cool point to make.
Yeah.
So I'm an end user in this context, right? So I'm the one who's always asking, so what's it going to cost? And I think the industry as a whole, we could all work a little bit better to figure out how to estimate that. How is it licensed? How do I spin up Adobe licenses on a virtual computer, make them go away and come back again exactly the same? How much compute time, space, and energy are we spending for this edit versus that edit, a craft edit versus heads and tails out, and how do I manage what I spin up? The automations, John, that you put into place, all those APIs and in and out, that's cool. How do we figure out what egress fees are in certain cases? Like how do we calculate that? I know, Justin, we were talking about getting ready for this show here. We're like, we know a lot of people, is now the time to go into these workflows, or is it not? It's never a good time. It's always the time you have. We see people now going back because it costs so much money, they found out, to do the AWS and the Azure workflows, and oh my gosh, let's rethink this. And they are, right? They're getting cheaper. And I think you mentioned there's various things people are doing to sort of level out those costs. And I think that is a huge thing the industry can do, is just figure out a way to get us the knowledge and the information to say, you know what, your OpEx is going to be this, but your CapEx last year was that. Yeah. So what's the story? You can help us with that story as well.
Justin, you have a point?
So not as an end user, as a service provider, this is very complicated to process and deal with. NEP or any service provider, we have to use multiple vendors to provide the end product to our clients. And each vendor has their own license model. Each vendor changes it as they want to, when they want to. And for us, as traditionally, our sales pipeline has always kind of been pretty easy, right? We have hardware that has a fixed CapEx cost. It costs us this much. We can easily, price out what a truck would cost or a facility would cost to build. Where now we are building facilities or systems on COTS hardware, running software, and any software can run on that from any vendor. Depends on the actual need of the client. And to price that out is very complicated. It requires the entire industry to kind of rethink how their sales pipelines work. And to forecast pricing is also a complicated problem. It's like a whole new division within a company that needs to be built to be able to support that sales pipeline.
So about 2 years ago, I was brought on to Diversified by Jason Kornweiss to figure out what we needed to do to build a cloud practice at Diversified. And at the time, we really didn't have a solid cloud practice. And there was still the point of, well, it's always going to be more expensive in the cloud. And I came in with no, it doesn't have to be that way. And it doesn't have to be that way because you build orchestration tools around turning things on and turning things off and spinning things up and spinning things down. For the next year, I spent most of my time reestablishing every vendor relationship that we had at Diversified for us to start having a one-on-one conversation with them to talk about pricing, to talk about getting involved with you at a dev level instead of just you make a product, we sell and integrate a product. That led into us releasing a product or announcing a project at NAB this year called Intelligent Orchestration. That's part of a larger platform we're developing. That platform includes an entire pricing tool that as you start running infrastructure, we can pull pricing and information from your accounts and give you predictive analytics on what your account's going to look like next year or next week based on what you spent already and understanding more about what your egress. These are the things. Egress, storage in S3, moving things into Glacier, things like that, just to pick on AWS in this case. We can start getting ideas of what you're using and then predict what you're going to be looking at in the future. But even more important to that is giving your operators a one pane of glass solution so they don't have to be AWS architects to launch infrastructure into cloud environments. This has been the challenge with 2110. I talked about it with a bunch of people over lunch. If you're a TV station in a small market and you want to put a production infrastructure in place, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to tell you to go with SDI. And the reason I do that is because you probably can't afford an engineer that can do 2110 networking. It's very complicated. You need a special set of knowledge to do that. And that doesn't get built into your IT team who does your Excel spreadsheets and your Microsoft build out, right? You need to have a very specific set of knowledge to do that. Same thing goes with cloud. To be able to build secure and resilient cloud infrastructure, you either need to have architects that can build it for you and work with it, or you need a system that can help deploy those systems and do it securely based on your InfoSec best practices. So that's exactly what we're putting into place, and more of that will come out by IBC about what we're doing, but you can look online and see a ton of it about what we did at NAB. So my team now is basically vetting all the vendors that go into this product and how we can build the orchestration. I brought up things like OpenTofu and Terraform and Puppet and Chef and Ansible and tools like that because my team uses that every day. We're all broadcast engineers, but we transitioned our careers so that we can actually build infrastructure using these forward-thinking technologies. And this is a larger piece of what the innovation team at Diversified does with going through and looking at technology and figuring out better ways to use it, easier ways to deploy it, and better ways to explain to all of you what it's going to cost you to actually do this stuff, because we are still learning about how that works as well. So.
Yeah. Any changes? Yeah, and it does. It's always changing. I'm going to flip over to the topic of the moment, and that is what happened on Friday. We have roughly, after this topic, we might have 10 minutes left if we're lucky for Q&A. So if anybody's interested, the mic is right in the middle there. You might need to turn it on unless somebody wants to grab it and run it. So from a security perspective, super quick, we'll just go down the line. We can start with you, John, reverse it, and then we'll come back around, then Justin can hand the mic down. But what are each of your teams and organizations doing to prevent maybe what happened on Friday if you haven't already thought about it? And if you haven't thought about it, that's fine. But that was nuts. Like Marty and Tom aren't here because of that. So like how do we get better at this stuff?
I mean, I think actually Jeremy's previous presentation kind of showed this a little bit in terms of architecture, right? architecture is super important, making sure that you have an environment where you can roll things out in a meaningful and measured way, right? Making sure that you have a dev environment, make sure that you have a deployment pipeline that allows you to plan your releases. And also, just candidly, how reliant are we on external factors for pushing updates to us, right? I mean, and one of the reasons why, well, I won't speak for LinkedIn, but one of the reasons why we weren't working over the weekend is because we don't, we manage all of that ourselves, right? Patch management, now there's overhead associated with that. But when you're building your architecture, and then when you're building your support strategy, whether that's all in-house or you're relying on vendors, like that has to be part of the conversation. The only other thing I'll say, I was thinking about when you mentioned this, is environmental consistency is also a really big deal, right? Like, support gets easier when you have a consistent environment, but when you have outliers, that's more things you have to test, more things that you have to make sure will go according to plan, and things you have to account for as part of your little nuances in your test and rollout plan. So.
Yeah, Friday was crazy, kind of unprecedented. I mean, in today's world, it's not going to be the last time something like that happens. So really, infrastructure is where it has to start. Build with full redundancy, full -7 workflows across the board to protect one system, right? So if one goes down, you're still active as much as possible. Infrastructure is code wherever possible, so that if there is a catastrophic failure, you can be back up and running as quickly as you can spin up that code.
Can we rely on AI to do what a video engineer did back in the 90s and the 2000s to heal a network if it does get taken down? How do we keep the Super Bowl and the election on the air with software, I guess is my question.
Not today. I don't think so. Get like the panelists that was talking about AI, give it a week, maybe it'll be ready. AI is kind of insane. It's what it's doing today. I mean, just think back to like the first AI video we had with Will Smith eating spaghetti and how crazy it was and how uncanny it was. Like it was hard to watch, where now you have stuff that's almost hard to see the difference of it. So.
Yeah, Dave Van Hoy still has a gift card to give out somewhere, so we have to hear what part of that video was AI.
So I would argue real quick.
Yeah, go for it.
You want to go first?
I would just say real quickly, I would argue the more things change, the more they're the same. You mentioned architecture is the answer. It's always been the answer. We designed TV studios 30 years ago with redundancies in place. Jeremy's diagram is full redundant red and blue networks. It's architecture.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that Marty isn't here with us, but yesterday I was in Malaysia. So 15 hours ahead and still kind of jet lagged, not going to lie. But I'm really glad I made it. I was a little afraid that I wouldn't. But yeah, again, I can't speak on behalf of all of Adobe, but testing. I think has definitely been key, and something that I've observed from within the product org as well that is so key. Like before every release, making sure that all the proper testing is in place, and you just really can't underestimate the importance of that in performance and stability, and also again working with. I talk about partners a lot, but partners are important in making sure that with every release too, we're also thinking about all our hardware partners and just not letting anything slip through the cracks, because the impact can be astronomical, as we can see, and really impacted every part of the globe. And I felt that in Southeast Asia. I had so many friends whose flights were canceled, and like even coming from Singapore to Malaysia, like my uncle was stranded, and just really glad I got back to the Bay Area safely.
So let's zoom out a little bit, because this affected a broadcast market in maybe 2% of the world. That was all the broadcast market piece was. What happened was a long story about why a third-party company has kernel-level access to Windows, and why when they push a patch, which the insurance policy that the enterprise has with their cybersecurity policy requires automated patching in real time. You can't sit and test it and go, yeah, I'm not going to push that patch, because then you just let yourself open to an exploit. So it started at the top and then trickled down. So 8.5 million systems were affected, which then spelled out to 250 million systems that got affected. So the entire supply chain went down. It started very small. It's like the blackout that happened in New York and in the Northeast in 2002, 2004. It started with a tree falling down in Ohio and took out the Northeast, right? The entire Northeast was down. So the end-all be-all here is that is something that's so much bigger than just how do we make sure we have these red-blue networks and everything. We are so dependent on a specific stack of technology from the top to the bottom that even if you were running Linux or Mac systems, but you were not able to authenticate through AD, you weren't able to log into Linux or Mac systems. It didn't matter what system you were on. So do we firewall our systems off and put these things that are totally blocked out from the world? When we build a 2110 environment, generally that entire core 2110 environment doesn't have internet access. You leave that walled off. So maybe you frame out that piece of the environment so that you can actually not have that happen. So what happens at, and I don't want to burn too much time, but at 4:09 at UTC, a bad patch got pushed, patch 291, right? And then that from CrowdStrike, by 5:57, it was fixed. If everyone had a backup policy in their AWS account that backed up every EBS storage, the OS basically storage for their environment, and had a backup from like a couple hours before, they could have just waited until CrowdStrike said, go ahead, we fixed the patch, loaded that version of the EBS backup onto the EC2 instance, relaunched the instance, and it would have pulled the proper patch. You would never have had a blue screen. You would have seen it, you would have shut down, you would have waited. But what happened in some cases, in one place, a friend of mine told me his CEO reformatted his hard drive, and he had presentations for the board on that were not shared to cloud storage or any other remote storage. He lost his entire presentation that he was supposed to give to the board the next day. I mean, come on.
At least he had an excuse.
Well, that's not, it's like the dog ate my homework, man. Let's put some stuff in place to make sure this works. At the end of the day, there are mechanisms in place that are so much bigger than our industry, but as an industry, we need to sit back and motivate the people above us to understand what we do. Chris and I have conversations about IT departments who don't get 2110, and nor should they most of the time. Just like your IT and your CISO shouldn't be the same department, your CISO should have a testing department that looks at IT. Broadcast media should have a dedicated IT department that sits next to the IT department at enterprise environments to be able to educate each other about what's going on there, and then we figure out how to make this better from top to bottom.
Thank you, Tom. That was quite enlightening. I had no idea. Now I know. It's like the NBC, and now you know. Does anybody, we got a few minutes for questions. Does anybody have any questions for anybody on this panel, including John on the Zoom call? No questions? No questions.
The only panel
Going once? Okay, I've got a safety question in case nobody asked questions. Going green. How do we best utilize the tools in front of us we're talking about spinning up and spinning down resources in our production environments, live or post. How do we get better at, we're talking about carbon footprint reduction. To me, software-defined workflow is like perfectly suited to help with that. I know when hard drives are spinning and they get turned into a low spin mode, they're still on, they're still powered, but we are getting better at creating chips and silicone that can go into super low power mode. Are we going to get better at this? Are we going to actually, put money where our mouth is and reduce our carbon footprint? Anybody have any thoughts on that on the panel? John, you're nodding.
Well, the carbon footprint is one aspect of it, but it kind of goes hand in hand with the cost to serve metric that we were talking about earlier, right? If someone's moving to a software-defined workflow and they're moving to maybe a lot of cloud-centric workflows, if you're going to just lift and shift and go from an on-prem environment and do the exact same thing in the cloud that you're doing on-prem, you're kind of missing my opinion is you're kind of missing the point, right? Because that's not what the cloud is necessarily for, at least not entirely. So I think, part of it is just being smart, right? Being smart about like, how do we burst? How do we only spit it when we need at the time that we need it, and then not use resources? Just like all of us in the room, right? If we're sitting at our desk twiddling our thumbs, it's not really a good effective use of our time. So let's put our efforts where they need to be, and then, utilize our resources effectively.
So another piece in here is when you're using the GPU on, say, an EC2 instance like a G4DN 5XL, G4DN like 4XL. That's 4 T4 GPUs. If you look at the GPU usage meter on like any piece of software running on there, you're usually utilizing maybe 25 to 30% of any of those GPUs, and it's a waste. The beauty is that NVIDIA is putting out a whole bunch of AI-based GPUs that have multi-threading technology, so we can start treating them almost like a processor. So I can use the pieces of that GPU much more efficiently. So if we can start doing that and using shared GPU, shared memory, shared compute across the board where I have multiple services attaching the same compute instance, the same GPU, and the same RAM, you get faster throughput, but you also get more efficiency on the system. So that's a big piece.
Yeah, the efficiencies, and even just the idea that it's one of the sales pitches I give my upper executives teams. It's like, there's less money that we have to spend in our equipment rooms in Manhattan, right? But to John's point, it's lifting it and shifting it to cloud doesn't exactly alleviate that altogether. But I would argue that the processing becomes much more efficient quicker and turns over quicker. So me personally, if I do 1,000 shows a year in New York, next year it'll be 1,000 shows a year in cloud. It's just going to use more efficient CPUs every year because they're always just going to get more efficient. That would be my best argument for that.
Chris, if I could sorry, I know you're passing the mic. If I could add on though, right? Here's the thing. Those CPUs or GPUs that you're sitting in New York may or may not be used when APAC is online, right? So now they're just sitting there being unused. But those same CPUs can be used when New York is sleeping if it's in the cloud, right? And so that's back to the architecture thing that we've been saying previously on this call. That's where getting that design right, being resource conscious becomes super important.
Yeah, and that's a great kind of thought about intelligent orchestration. Like it has the ability to go, I know that the processing for this particular thing doesn't need to be done in 2 seconds. It can take 2 hours. So let's use processing elsewhere to offload that. So that is kind of answering a bit the question. So anything from NAP or Adobe?
For us, trucks and facilities, right? We're going from giant refrigerator size routers to a couple switches. It's a massive, we no longer have to put 400 amp services in these trucks. It's a massive savings in power and all the cooling and everything that's needed goes along with that.
Awesome. We have a question.
John Iselson, a question. We're creatures of habit, so you're talking about changing workflow, but you're talking the technology side, the wetware. Yeah. I didn't like it when rendering became faster because when the render went too fast, I couldn't go to the In-N-Out burger. Rendering. Our previous presenter talked about how they did all this in the new way, but the people walked into that facility and were able to run it. How much would they have done it differently if they didn't have to bring the people in who had to use their creature of habits of running their workflow?
That goes back to 20 years ago, right? How did we do TV 20 years ago versus, and how much of it do we do today because that's how grandma used the pots she used 20 years ago? I can't exactly answer that. I would argue there'd be a lot less people doing it, and that's just a sheer fact. Like someone told me about one guy switching, the LinkedIn folks are switching, one guy is switching 3 shows in one switch. We currently do that with 2 or 3.
Eliza, what about from an editor perspective? I'm curious what your thought is on that.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of like my days in media management. When you had to be on site and like have all the drives like right there, because or there would be drives coming from like Iceland or Norway and had to be on site to like load all of that up to the cloud. But like what I think excites me about how the industry is evolving is that not so much that those roles will be like done away with, but it's it's that the time saved, right? And that amount of time can be allocated towards something that's more efficient and for creativity and for more, teamwork and for assistant editors to do more creative work potentially, right? So I think personally, I think it's a positive, but we'll find time for in and out runs.
Yeah, and every vendor we work with currently either has a third-party partner who makes a control surface, or their control surface that you know and love is available to be used with that decentralized infrastructure. I don't like to call it cloud. It's more of a decentralized thing because it could be on-prem, it could be over there, it could be up there, who knows. But the familiar tactile feel of doing production stays very much the same. But for a lot of my friends who are I spent 25 years in broadcast thus far, and the first 20 were spent doing live production. So I have friends that now do 3 events a day for ESPN, but they live in Montana. But they're doing graphics for a show on ESPN. They do 3. They used to just do 1. They'd go on a truck, they'd go do their show. I'm sure at NEP you're seeing that as well, where an operator who used to just do 1 show a day is now doing 2 shows, and they're double dipping. People used to say, oh, you can't do that. And you couldn't, because you couldn't be in 2 cities at one time, but now you can, and you can live in a third. So
and you have editing teams now just working remotely from several continents. I mean, it's amazing.
Around the clock.
Yeah, around the clock, really, so no one really sleeps.
Thank you, COVID.
Well,
any more questions? I see none. We are at time. Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate the panel. Appreciate your time. We have one more case study. I think, Mr. Van Hoy, you're going to introduce that.